In this podcast episode, Peter Hitchens offers a deeply pessimistic but historically grounded analysis of the current state and future trajectory of Britain. The conversation navigates through themes such as the country's economic decline, cultural disintegration, political delusion, and foreign policy misadventures. Hitchens reflects on Britain's 20th century history, the consequences of both world wars, the erosion of traditional social structures, and the growing appetite for big government. Amid warnings of impending fiscal crisis, societal disorder, and political extremism, he also touches on the failures in education, justice, and public infrastructure. The episode further explores how delusion and propaganda have shaped public opinion and governance, the myth of British power and special relationships, and the dangers of a looming war mentality. Peter Hitchens describes Britain's economic situation as dire, with the government borrowing money simply to pay the interest on existing debts, a hallmark of a country on the brink of fiscal ruin. The British currency is losing value rapidly, and if it plunges into a full-blown inflationary spiral, the illusion of wealth that underpins government spending and services will collapse. This financial instability could result in hyperinflation, social disorder, and a catastrophic decline in living standards. He criticizes political figures and parties, particularly the Labour Party and leaders like Andy Burnham, for promising expensive, fundamentally unworkable policies without resources to back them. Burnham, for example, is portrayed as attempting to implement policies doomed to failure because they require spending that the country cannot afford. Both the political left and right are seen as harboring delusions about Britain's wealth and global role, resulting in dangerous foreign policies and misplaced priorities, such as maintaining costly Cold War-era nuclear deterrence and engaging in overseas conflicts. Hitchens laments the collapse of traditional social structures, especially the weakening of the married family. Since the late 1950s, governments have progressively substituted the role of the family with the state, which has led to the near disappearance of the family as a functional unit in many parts of the country. This shift has forced women en masse into the workforce, a development Hitchens regards as a cynical collusion between feminist movements and big business, resulting in adverse consequences for child-rearing and social cohesion. He highlights that while many women polled would prefer to spend more time with their children, economic pressures and societal expectations effectively conscript them into wage labor. The state's attempt to care for children and the elderly is both expensive and ineffective compared to traditional family care. This ongoing cultural degradation compounds the country's problems, making it harder to sustain a functioning society or governance. The country's institutions, from education to criminal justice and public services, are depicted as being in a state of decay. Hitchens points out the destruction of industrial capacity, mostly during the Thatcher era, which hampers Britain's ability to recover economically. The education system, he argues, has been ruined, leaving a talent pool that is insufficiently trained either for skilled trades or elite rational thought. Similarly, the justice system and police services are described as dysfunctional and overwhelmed, with lengthy waits for trials and poor quality proceedings contributing to a sense that nothing works. Public infrastructure, particularly transport, is congested and deteriorating. This failure of governance and services feeds into widespread public disillusionment and mistrust, further eroding national cohesion. The discussion delves into what Hitchens sees as an age of widespread societal delusion, where people have been encouraged to suspend critical thinking and embrace comforting falsehoods. Drawing on his background in Marxist-Leninist training, he stresses the importance of distinguishing pretexts from underlying motives, a skill he finds lacking in modern public discourse. Examples given include the COVID-19 pandemic response, where public compliance with questionable mandates reflected deep-seated tendencies toward conformism and acceptance of government control. Hitchens argues that British people have surprisingly embraced big government and dependency on the state, a shift from historical national character, and this uncritical acceptance is dangerous given the government's current inability to sustain itself financially or morally. Hitchens challenges nostalgic beliefs in British geopolitical and cultural preeminence, describing them as delusions that obstruct sober policymaking. He notes that after decades of decline beginning with the First World War, Britain is neither rich nor powerful, as many would like to believe. The notion of a special relationship with the United States is dismissed as largely mythical. In his experience, America pays little real attention or respect to Britain. He points to the collapse of the British Empire and reduction from a creditor nation to a debtor state as critical historical milestones that set Britain on a path of decline. This loss of real power is at odds with persistent public illusions of influence and grandeur that fuel misguided foreign commitments and military spending. A significant portion of the conversation is devoted to Britain's disastrous involvement in the First World War, which Hitchens argues was the gravest mistake in British history. He details how the war drained Britain financially, killed hundreds of thousands of its best young men, and irreversibly damaged the country's social and economic foundations. The post-war era failed to arrest decline. Britain grew increasingly dependent on U.S. goodwill while its naval and military power were constrained. The interwar and War II periods further entrenched Britain's reduced status, leaving a legacy of economic stagnation and diminished global influence. Hitchens contends that the sacrifices of War II, often portrayed as contributing to Britain's finest hour, did not translate into sustained power or security. The episode examines how war and economic decline reshaped British society. The loss of a generation in WWI altered demographics and morale. The expansion of state power accelerated, social cohesion frayed. The post-war drive toward the welfare state and nationalization attempted to manage decline, but also entrenched dependency. Hitchens observes that political elites repeatedly succumbed to arrogance and delusion, making catastrophic decisions based on flawed assumptions of Britain's position in the world. The embracing of big government as a solution, combined with cultural transformation and economic mismanagement, has led to the current crisis. Hitchens warns that in times of crisis, political extremism flourishes. While both far-left and far-right groups exist, he is more concerned about fringe figures gaining influence amidst public angst. The possibility of Britain being embroiled in dangerous foreign wars, notably in Europe or the Middle East, is cited as a factor that could accelerate national ruin. He also criticizes the repeated attempts by intelligence and military figures to prepare the public for future conflicts, interpreting these as deliberate efforts to shift society toward a wartime footing. This war fever threatens to exacerbate social tensions and accelerate decline rather than protect national interests. Hitchens is critical of the modern education system, which he sees as failing to cultivate knowledge, critical thinking, and a shared cultural foundation. Instead of encouraging learning and intellectual development, education has embraced child-centered myths of ignorance and relativism. This results in a populace ill-equipped to understand or challenge political propaganda and simplifications. He sees this intellectual decline as a key reason why absurd political actions gain acceptance and why society becomes vulnerable to manipulation and conformity pressures. Despite his grim outlook, Hitchens acknowledges moments where history shows that society can recover from catastrophe, citing the aftermath of the fall of communism and the U.S. recovery after the Great Depression and World War II. Nonetheless, he expresses deep skepticism about Britain's current political class's ability or willingness to implement difficult but necessary reforms. Much of the episode is shaped by Hitchens's lifelong frustration at being ignored when warning about decline, and his rejection of easy optimism or seductive political narratives. Yet he concedes that recovery, while unlikely, cannot be completely ruled out if hard truths are faced and courageously acted upon. Hitchens reflects on missed opportunities, particularly the rise of David Cameron's leadership and the Blairite dominance of the Conservative Party, which thwarted more traditional conservative or reformist policies. He sees the inevitability of crisis increasing as delusions persist and competent leadership remains absent. He stresses the necessity of voting against what you don't want as a pragmatic approach given the irrationality and emotionalism dominating contemporary British politics. Absent this, catastrophe seems all but assured. A central historical argument Hitchens makes is that Britain should never have entered the First World War. He outlines how the war was largely a geopolitical miscalculation rooted in complex alliances and the desire to influence Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, with disastrous consequences. Hitchens paints a vivid picture of political arrogance, false narratives, and the unraveling of a once cohesive British society in the blaze of industrial warfare. This foundational error set the course for Britain's rapid decline throughout the 20th century. The episode also touches upon the tense naval negotiations between Britain and the United States post-WWI, where Britain was forced to reduce naval power and break alliances, notably with Japan. Such events symbolized the erosion of sovereignty and global influence. The failure of Western powers to assist in Russia's economic reforms after the Soviet collapse contributed to Russia's descent into dictatorship and decline, in contrast to the more successful transitions seen in places like Poland. These missed chances underscore the precariousness of political order and recovery. Throughout the discussion, Hitchens emphasizes how propaganda and appeals to emotion have been effective in driving public behavior, citing Nazi Germany and contemporary examples like the COVID pandemic restrictions. He warns that many people, even intelligent and well-meaning ones, are susceptible to manipulation when faced with fear or appealing narratives. This ease of manipulation has facilitated the rise of absurd or destructive policies and the suppression of dissenting views, worsening the country's cultural and political malaise. The trend towards state provision and control is presented as a significant departure from Britain's historical identity as a society valuing independence and self-reliance. The expansion of government into nearly every aspect of life undermines individual freedoms and fosters a culture of dependency. While acknowledging some justified roles for the state, especially during wartime, Hitchens warns that the post-war enlargement of government was excessive and unsustainable, leading directly to Britain's contemporary crises. The episode closes with Hitchens voicing alarm over the current drive to prepare Britain for possible new wars. Intelligence officials and defense chiefs foster a climate of fear and readiness that risks normalizing conflict and division. He recalls his experiences in Russia and contrasts the grim realities on the ground with the overblown narratives used to justify militarization and confrontational foreign policy. He fears this trajectory will only deepen Britain's problems and alienate its people. Peter Hitchens shares his own journey of frustration and disillusionment, noting how his early optimism gave way to despair as his warnings went unheeded. Despite enjoying the act of articulating his views, he finds the political and cultural trajectory deeply tragic. His parting reflections underscore a profound need for honesty, courage, and political realism in Britain, qualities he fears are in short supply, but without which recovery remains remote.